Welcome to another episode of the podcast, The Sinking of the Bismarck, The Deadly Hunt by William Shiver. Okay, so now we are on Chapter 7. The Bismarck is found again. All day long on May 25th and far into the night, 3 Catalinas from the Northern Ireland base had been out over the distant sea searching for the Bismarck. Shortly after midnight, one of them had sighted what looked in the murky night like a battleship and 4 destroyers. The big ship did not respond to the plane signals. She could have been the Bismarck, and then again she might have been the King George V. In the black, stormy night, the pilot could not tell. The 3 long-range flying boats did not get back to base until nearly noon on May 26th. After almost 24 hours in the air. Long before that, the 2 other flying boats of Coastal Command from the same base in Northern Ireland set out to join in the search. They had taken off from Lough Erne at 3 o'clock a.m., while the night was still black. The area they were to search had been at least strictly defined. This was a square some 700 miles due west of Brest. It was based partly on the positions of the Bismarck as plotted by the British radio direction finding stations, taking into consideration her probable course and speed. It was also based, in part, on one man's hunch. This man was Air Marshal Sir Frederick Bowhill, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Air Force Coastal Command. Bowhill had been an officer in both the Merchant Maritime Marine and the Navy before becoming a flyer in the Royal Air Force. He thus knew the sea as well as the air, a rare quality in any airman. From the moment news had received that the Bismarck was lost, Sir Frederick had a hunch about what she was up to. She was making for Brest or St. Nazaire. Several naval officers at the Admiralty and on the ships at sea had the same feeling, but Bowhill's hunch was something special. He was sure that the German battleship would not head directly to the French ports. Rather, he thought, she would follow a wide circle. She would steer first into Cape Finisterre on the northwest coast of Spain. Since Spain was neutral, the Cape's lighthouse was still functioning. The lights along the coasts of France and England were extinguished during the war as a measure of self-protection against hostile ships and planes. Then the Air Marshal reasoned that Bismarck would proceed around the Bay of Biscay to haven at St. Nazaire or Brest. On the evening of May 25th, when Bowhill conferred with the Admiralty, he insisted on being allowed to follow his hunch. One of the 2 Catalinas must cover an assumed course of the Bismarck toward Cape Finisterre in Spain. After some argument, the Admiralty gave in to him on condition that the second plane search farther north of an assumed course of the Enray directly toward Brest. The square of search thus became a rectangle tilted northeast. It was about 200 miles long and 100 miles wide. It lay some 500 miles northwest of Cape Finisterre and 700 miles due west of Brest. If the Bismarck were taken for either place, Bowhill calculated, she ought to be somewhere within the rectangle by 10 a.m. on May 26th. It was a rather large area for just 2 planes to cover, and the weather reports were discouraging. There were high winds and low clouds over mountainous seas. The Catalinas would have to get down low to discover any ships. And identification in such conditions of bad visibility would not be easy. Still, Sir Frederick was fairly optimistic as his 2 aircraft skimmed over the waters of Lough Erne, rose into the air, and headed southwest into the darkness before dawn. As daylight broke on May 26th, Force H was getting close to the prey, but closing in on the Bismarck was not the only problem faced by Vice Admiral Somerville aboard his flagship Renown. He had another. Ever since steaming out of Gibraltar on the night of the 23rd, he had been concerned about running into the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. On that day, British planes had reported the two warships still in Brest, while they were undergoing repairs from a bombing by RAF bombers some weeks before. But after Somerville's squadron headed northward in the Atlantic, he received no more news about the two German ships. By May 25th, 2 days later, the commander of Force H had to face the possibility that the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau might well have completed their repairs and put out from Brest to come to the rescue of the Bismarck. If so, they might be dangerously near his own squadron, which was no match for them. Twice during May 25th, as he sped toward the general direction of the Bismarck, Admiral Somerville had sent out aircraft from the carrier Ark Royal to look for the two German battlecruisers, but visibility had been so poor that the planes had been recalled shortly after taking off. In the evening, the Admiral gave orders that the first dawn patrol of planes next day would have to disregard the Bismarck. Desperate as the search for her was, they must look first to see if the German battlecruisers were nearby. The night of the 25th grew very stormy. So high were the waves that speed had to be drastically reduced, from 26 knots to 23, and then down to 19, and finally, just after midnight, to 17 knots. At this rate, Somerville realized he would never be able to converge on the Bismarck, and the high seas were threatening to smash up his ships. The small destroyers were barely able to keep afloat, and the waves pounded over the decks of the cruiser Sheffield and the battlecruiser Renown. Even the flight deck of the Ark Royal, 63 feet above the waterline, was being washed by the heavy seas. Her bow and the stern were rising and falling a distance of 55 feet as the ship pitched and rolled. If such seas kept on, the carrier would be unable to launch any planes at all from the lurching deck when the decisive time arrived. The stormy seas were troubling for the Germans, too. Early on the afternoon of May 25th, Naval Group West had radioed Admiral Lutyens that it was assembling 7 U-boats to protect him on his run into Brest. At 7:32 p.m., it advised that the German fleet commander that strong air forces also were being mobilized to give him protection and to bomb his pursuers. 3 destroyers, if added, were putting out from Brest to join him, but the seas were too high for them. Early in the morning of May 26, Naval Group West informed Admiral Lutyens by radio that the weather made it impossible for the destroyers to leave port. He would have to depend on close air cover for the time being. The truth was, as the German admiral realized, that he was still too far from land for the German bombers to be any help to him. Even the longer-range German reconnaissance planes could not find the British pursuers in the low visibility of the storm. The Bismarck herself had to reduce speed in the rough seas for fear of worsening the damage to her side and to her oil tanks. Still, she was plowing along at 20 knots, and her big guns were in tip-top shape. She had finally given the slip to the shadowing British ships. Admiral Lutyens realized this now, that enemy craft were looking for him and might not be far off. Enemy aircraft were still looking for him, and they might not be far off, he knew. But give them another few hours until darkness of that midday of May 26th. Then, during the ensuing light, he would arrive well within the protective cover of the famed Luftwaffe bombers and the U-boats. German fleet commander, though by nature rather pessimistic, could not help but believe that he had a fairly good chance of escaping British detection during the rest of the daylight hours. The low clouds, the thick mist, the heavy seas would help cover him until night fell. Then danger would be all but over. The daylight of May 27, as he would be in safe waters. His hopes were very shortly to be dashed. At 7 a.m. on May 26th, the Ark Royal sent out her dawn patrol. The scouting planes were to look for the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau coming out of Brest and for any U-boats that might be near. An hour and a half later, 10 swordfish planes minus their torpedoes, were brought up on the flight deck at 8:35. After the carrier had turned into the wind, they began to take off in search of the Bismarck. The Ark Royal was still tossing in the rough seas. It was touch and go whether the pilots would be able to get their little biplanes off the deck without cracking up or plunging into the waves. Vice Admiral Somerville on the bridge of the Renown watched anxiously through his binoculars as the Swordfish careened off the pitching deck. To his relief, all got off safely. The aircraft had fuel for a 3.5-hour search. There now began for the men of the British ships a long and nerve-wracking wait. Somerville had radioed all the vessels in the area that the vital aerial search, on which they believed all now depended, had begun. The King George V was some 300 miles to the northwest, and Somerville's squadron zigzagging southeast at 24 knots. On her port bow, but still out of sight, were the Rodney with 3 destroyers. Neither ship knew exactly where the other was. However, they had been observing radio silence. They calculated, however, that they were not far apart and sailing in pretty much the same course. Both battleships took in Somerville's signal that he had launched 10 planes from the Ark Royal to search for the Bismarck in the area between the 2 British naval forces. Admiral Tovey, aboard the King George V, Captain Derry Dimple Hamilton on the Rodney, and Captain L.E.H. Mound, the determined skipper of the Ark Royal, counted the minutes and waited nervously for some word from the scouting planes. These British commanders would have agreed with Admiral Lutyens on one thing. If the Bismarck could not be located, then this day she was safe. A great German victory would have been completed. With the Hood unavenged, the British would have suffered a complete defeat. In fact, a disaster. 9 o'clock came, 9:30, 10. There was no news at all from the searching planes. Soon they would have turned back to refuel. Then at 10:30 a.m., a British plane began transmitting a message by radio. Excited wireless operators on a dozen British ships began writing it down. One battleship sighted, position 4930 north, 2150 west, steering 150 degrees, roughly southeast by east, speed 20 knots. One battleship. Was it the Bismarck? Admiral and captains went quickly to their chart rooms and marked the given position on their maps. So far they knew no British battleship was in the immediate vicinity. It must be the Bismarck. And what British aircraft had found her? The radio message did not come from any of the Ark Royal Swordfish planes. Instead, the sender identified his plane as Z/209. That would be a Catalina Z of the 209th Squadron, Royal Air Force Coastal Command. It was one of the 2 flying boats which had been sent out that morning to make the long flight from Northern Ireland to the area of search. It had been in the air for over 7 hours when, in the words of one of the pilots, George, the automatic pilot, was flying the aircraft at 500 feet when we saw a warship. I was in the second pilot's seat when the occupant of the seat beside me, an American, said, "What the devil's that?" I stared ahead and saw a dull black ship through the mist which curled above a very rough sea. "Looks like a battleship," he said. I said, "Better get closer, go round its stern." I thought it might be the Bismarck because I could see no destroyers around the ship, and I should have seen them all had she been a British warship. Actually, as we know, the King George V no longer had any destroyers with her. If the pilot had happened to see the British ship, he undoubtedly would have been rated out to the Bismarck. But luck was with the British this day. The pilot continued his report. I left my seat, went to the wireless operator's table, grabbed a piece of paper, and began to write out a signal. The second pilot had taken over from George and gone up to 1500 feet into the broken cloud. As we came around, he must have slightly misjudged his position. Instead of coming up stern, we found ourselves right over the ship in an open space between the clouds. 2 black puffs appeared outside the starboard wingtip. In a moment we were surrounded by black puffs. Stuff began to rattle against the hull. Some of it went through, and a lot made dents in it. I scribbled "end of message" and handed it to the wireless operator. It was this message, crackling over the airwaves, that electrified the officers and crew of every British warship engaged in the chase, which up to this fateful moment had been so frustrating. And the message had come out from 2 planes which had been sent out as a result of Air Marshal Sir Frederick Bowhill's hunch. A Z/209 had flown the southerly course of search on Sir Frederick's gamble that the German battleship was steering fast for Spain. And indeed, the Bismarck's position, as reported at 10:30 a.m. on May 26, showed that Admiral Lutyens had kept on a direct course not for Brest, as the Admiralty had predicted, but for Cape Finisterre. This was what Sir Frederick had been certain for all along. Acting on his hunch had paid off. After being lost for 31.5 hours, the Bismarck had been found again. Thank you for watching today's video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. See you in the next episode. Bye!